Oh, hello. Thank you for coming in and joining in today. It's been a few weeks since I posted anything on YouTube. I'm hoping you're enjoying the summer weather like I have been. It's early spring, and it's hard to believe that Easter's just a few weeks, really about a week and a half away. Today, we're going to be talking about and looking at feelings that cause us to feel that we're unwanted, or do I really matter anymore? All of us at one time or another experience the low times of self doubt and what our purpose is. I've been reading the Bible through this last couple months. I started reading it again from cover to cover. I'm trying to pick up books and get back into reading it all the time. And I've noticed that some of the greatest people we read about that had a huge impact on the time that they were living and when the scriptures were being written, they had low self-esteem and didn't believe that they even mattered or that God even knew they were alive, much less that God would be using them and their circumstances for great victory in his name. And a few of the people I'd like to talk about today is Moses is one of them. He fled Egypt after murdering an Egyptian. He was 40 years old at that time, and he killed an Egyptian. Joshua and Caleb were two spies of the 12 that Moses sent into the promised land to see what they were up against to go into it. And they were ignored when they came back with the report that they had, because Caleb and Joshua had a report that, yeah, we can go in there and we can conquer the people. But the other 10 spies said, no, we can't. We're like grasshoppers in their eyes. There's no way that we can go in there and conquer and get the land that God's given us. And the majority of the people, and I think there's like 2 million of the Jewish people with them, they all were against going in to take over the land. So they landed up, the old story, 40 years they walked around the wilderness because they would not listen to what Caleb and Joshua had said. They were ignored. David was another one. We know him as King David in the Bible, but he was not even included as one of Jethro's sons when Samuel, the judge at the time, which was like a king of Israel, came to anoint the next king of Israel. His dad didn't even bother to have him come in from the herding the sheep, while his brothers, because his brothers were so much taller and older and better than him, because they were lined up to be the king, one of the men that Samuel would anoint to be the king. David wasn't even considered as part of that, and it was his son. And then we have Rahab, a woman in here that she was a harlot, which is a prostitute. And she was used to hide the men that before Joshua's army came in to view Jericho and to see what they were up against, because it was a walled city. And it would be the first battle that they were going to confront in the promised land that God was giving them. And then we had Saul, which his name was Paul also, was a man who set out to persecute the church, and he caused havoc, dragging men and women into prison because he believed that Jesus was a heretic and was teaching against all the laws of the religious leaders of his time, which Paul was one of them. Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees, which is like the Pope today. I mean, and he was out persecuting people that were following Christ after his resurrection. We can see that God can and does use people who are both highly regarded as well as those who are looked down upon because of their choices in life or circumstances. When we begin to criticize ourselves or think that we have been so long in a lifestyle that we will never get anywhere we want to be, just look at some of these people's lives that we are going to be looking at and what they did or didn't do. Yet God still had a plan and a purpose for them, and he used them to accomplish major victories that we all know about. We all know about the victories that we're going to be talking about. They're written in Scripture. They're historical facts of people that lived in the times of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, that God took people like that just didn't feel they mattered. And I can relate to these stories maybe more so than some, because for so many years I lived with so much shame because of the different marriages I've had in relationships, and how people little by little just disregarded me as a human being. They thought, she got married again and got another divorce. Like I didn't have any emotions. So your mind just starts to push, just like if you're a drug addict, you know that you have an addiction to something, or if you're an alcoholic. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a drug. I mean, mine was emotional, but there's people that gossip all the time. There's people that they take things that don't belong to them. I'm not going to call them a thief, but they do things they know they're not supposed to be doing. And after so long, people start recognizing them as such. And they don't even call you by their name. They go, oh, you know that drug addict, or you know that person that drinks all the time, or look at that woman that gets, they don't even call you by a name. They're just critical and just see who you are, who they think you are by what you've done. And what you've done is not who you are. It's just what you're doing at the time. And a lot of the people want to change, but they feel they can't because they've tried so many times to change and it never works. So they just give up. And Satan is the one who keeps putting the negative or blaming thoughts in our mind. We know for in truth, like, yes, did I have a lot of marriages and get, yes, that was not a lie. But the lie came in when I was devalued myself and people disregarded me, that I started believing the lie that Satan says you're a loser. So I had a lot of shame, and yeah, I did think I was a loser. I mean, there's not very many people that've been married that many times. How stupid are you, lady? Just like someone that takes drugs or drinks. You're addicted to something, you don't like the lifestyle you're in, but yet you don't know how to get out of it. And then because of the constant rut in your mind that keeps telling you, and the voice on your shoulder saying, look at you, you're a loser. How many times you say you're going to quit? And you're not able to overcome it because you don't have the tools to overcome it, or you don't have the understanding of how it can happen. And the Bible is full. That's why I'm so I don't even know what the word is. I have such passion about getting this word out to people, because God can change your life. He can change your mindset. He can change so many things that you don't think you can change, and he can do it. Is it easy? Sometimes it is. He can instantaneously stop somebody from doing something, but most of the time he has us work through it. But he gives us the strength, because it says in the Bible, greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. God is in us, Satan's in the world. And it's just like we have two people on our shoulders. One's the enemy, one's Jesus. And it's whose voice you listen to that's going to be fed and what you're going to react to. So you have a choice. And it's very difficult to make a choice on something that has been embedded in your life for years. I mean, sometimes people are born and their parents tell them they're useless, or their parents say you were a mistake. We didn't even want you. Look at you. You look at your brother. How come you can't do this? Your brother's doing this. Your sister can do this. Look at you. These are words that go into our mind and they don't go away. And and every time we go somewhere and someone says something negative, it's just another part of that rut. And then the rut gets so deep in us that we actually don't even know where it came from, but we just know that we feel less than, or that we're not wanted, or that we're in the way. There's a lot of things and children feel like that a lot because of what their parents did unknowingly. Some parents did it knowingly, and God forbid for that, but some parents say things and push kids against each other for what? Because of their own ways of thinking, and denigrating someone that they don't even realize that they're doing it. Jesus knew the strongholds that Satan can have over people. And in John 10, Jesus said in verse 10, he, talking about Satan, comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And then Jesus said in John 8, 31 through 36, I'm going to go to verses 32, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. A lot of people read that verse and they go, well, truth will set me free. What does it mean, the truth? The truth is of God. The lies of Satan, when you learn the truths of God's word and what he says about you, you will be set free. And then in verse 36, therefore, if the Son, which is Jesus, makes you free, you shall be free indeed. So he's telling you point blank, if you want to be freed from the lies that you're living with and your condemnation that you put onto yourself, because a lot of us walk around with self condemnation. We are so used to being disregarded and not mattering, or that people don't see us. I used to think called myself a cellophane person. You know, people, you would be there, but they really didn't know you. They didn't see you. They had no idea. You're just like this person walking around that no one really knows, and they don't really care. And that's a really hard place to be in life, especially in our society. And after COVID, oh my, it just catapulted those feelings towards so many people. And people have isolated. And when you're in isolation, that's Satan's greatest den. He loves when people are isolated because you're stuck in your own thinking, in your own trap, and you can't get out of that. You need to be social, and you need to have positive input and encouragement and something in your heart and in your spirit that lets you know I do matter. Because like it says in the Bible, God made each every individual person, and we're all made in the likeness of him, and we are all have great potential in us. All of us. I don't care if you're on the streets or if you're sitting on Nob Hill or in the stock market in New York City. It doesn't matter. We all have a purpose, and we all have something that God put in us to help other people with and to attain and to make the world better. But you have to hear it and you have to know it. And if you know it, then you can do something on it. And it's the best thing to do is to read it and see it instead of scrolling. We scroll. Sometimes at night I get bored and I'll get onto my phone or my iPad and I start scrolling through Facebook, or I scroll through whatever. And I look at the clock and 2 hours went by. And what did I accomplish? Nothing. In fact, I usually come up reading stuff that I didn't even want to read, and it verifies what I already think anyway. It's nothing encouraging. Very seldom is it very encouraging. So we need to learn how to step back and find encouragement. And the Bible's full of encouragement. Yeah, there's some thou shall nots, but they're not to make you unhappy. They're to make your life better. You know, like who would ever wanted to be a drug addict? When you first started smoking weed, or you took your first hit or snort of cocaine or whatever, it made you feel good because that's the carrot that Satan puts in front of you. And you're always running after that first high, and you'll never get that first high again because it was the lie. It came out starting good, and then all of a sudden, when you can't function properly without that, look what happened. It was slavery. It's bondage. And God does not want you to be in bondage. And that's why he says you will be set free. And what a wonderful, wonderful thing to hear when you feel like you're just imprisoned, especially in your own mind. So let's go back now at the beginning of the list that I started with. And we'll talk about Moses for a moment. Moses was born as a Hebrew. He was the king of Egypt at the time when he was born, wanted all the male Hebrew babies killed because they were outnumbering the Egyptian males being born. Isn't that sad? So his mother, Moses' mother, put him in a basket. She wrapped him in a blanket and she put him in the Nile River to save his life. And in that river, there was alligators. There was all kinds of stuff. You know, I'm sure there was mosquitoes. He could have got malaria. Who knows what could happen? But she wanted to save his life, and that was the best way she knew how to do it. So she put him in a basket to float down the Nile River. Now, here's where God comes in. As he was floating down the river, haphazardly, no, it was by total God's design that Pharaoh's daughter was in the river taking a bath when she saw this basket come down the river. So she looked in the basket, and I guess Moses was a pretty baby. She saw him, she picked him up, and she brought him into the palace, and she raised him as her son. Pharaoh was her dad that wanted all the Hebrew men killed, but yet here he was a Hebrew in the Egyptian palace being raised, and he was raised for 40 years. He had prestige, he had power, and he had authority. And in Exodus 2, verses 11 through 14, one day he decided to go out and watch all the slaves, which are his people, the Hebrews, and he wanted to see the burdens that they were under. And as he was walking around, he witnessed an Egyptian beating one of the slaves, one of the Hebrew men. And I don't think he meant to kill him, but at the time, I don't know what he did, but let's say he pulled him up, and I guess he got in a fight and an altercation, and he killed him. Well, he looked around and no one saw him, so he I'm paraphrasing now, but he saw him, so he buried him in the sand and he went on his way. And then a few days later, or a couple of days later, as he was walking around, he saw a Hebrew guy, a Hebrew slave, fighting with another Hebrew slave. So Moses looked at him. He says, "Why are you hitting each other?" And then one of the guys looked at him. He said, "Well, who are you? A prince, a judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you did the Egyptian the other day?" So Moses, at that point in time, said, "Oh Lord, somebody saw me do this." So he was fearful. So in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of the matter, he sought to kill Moses. So here's Moses, now 40 years old, running for his life out of Egypt, and he fled to Midian, which is like a desert. There's a lot of shepherds back in the day. And that's where he landed up living for 40 years. He met his wife there, and he was a shepherd. That's what he did. He went from the palace to being a shepherd. And then 40 years later, can you imagine, after 40 years, now he's 80, the Lord called him to go back to Egypt. The Pharaoh was still there because he wanted him to free his people that were still slaves in Egypt. So God didn't forget Moses, and he used him mightily. And everybody in the world knows about Moses and what he did, getting the people out. We all know the wilderness, the 10 plagues. I mean, the stories goes on and on and on. But yet Moses, at the time, he just felt like he was a loser. Now he's out there shedding, after all that education, all that he had, he was a shepherd for 40 years out in the desert. So if you think you've had a lot of time that you wasted, or you think that you can be 40 years old, God still has a plan for you. You just have to hear it, and you got to know it. Joshua was a man that he was with Moses the whole time. He was kind of like his captain, maybe. And he was under Moses when God called Joshua that he wanted him to replace Moses. Now, can you imagine Joshua? He was probably 40 at the time, or maybe younger. He was probably younger. But Moses was his boss to some degree. He was the one who was in command of the million of Jews that were walking through the wilderness. But he learned a lot from Moses, and God was calling him to replace him because Moses wasn't going to be going into the promised land. So, but I lost my place here. So when he replaced Moses, and after 40 years, he entered the promised land. But first, they had to battle each of the cities that were taking over. So when Joshua took over Moses' spot, he had to send in a couple of spies to look out the land, because now it's 40 years later, to see what they were up against, to go in to take over what God was going to give them. And remind you, God was going to give them the promised land. It didn't mean that they weren't going to have to fight for it, but God was giving it to them. So the mindset was, I already know this is my property. This is going to be mine, so we're going to have to go fight for it. He gives you a whole different mindset, knowing, I'll have some altercations just like we do with God in our life. We're going to have problems, but we have God on our side working with us to get through them. And that's like Moses. That's what you call comfort and encouragement. And they especially looked at Jericho, and they came to a house, because they were there for a few days. They came to the house of Rahab, and remember her earlier, and she was a prostitute. So here's two godly men going in to spy out the land that God's going to give them, and they land up going to the house of Rahab, and they lodged there to be, so they could get up and look around and go back to report Joshua what they saw. And in verse 2 through 24, I'm not going to go through all that, she hid them. The story is she hid them to save their lives from the king of Jericho, because the people of Jericho knew there was two men that were Hebrews that came into the town, to their walled city, and they knew they went to Rahab's house, which would be kind of normal. They were prostitutes, these were men, so it made sense that they would go there, although that's not why they went there. But she knew of their God, because they had heard about the come through the desert, and they knew the story about Moses. And in Joshua 6:22 through 25, verse 25, and Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwelled in Israel because she hid the messengers from Joshua that when he sent out his spies to Jericho. So her city that she saved, those two men, God protected her, and she was able to stay and live. She had to find a new place because they burnt down Jericho, but she was saved. And in Matthew, in the New Testament, now you go the Old Testament, go to the New Testament. In Matthew, first chapter, in the genealogy of Jesus, in verse 5, Rahab is listed in the lineage of Jesus. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. So Rahab, the prostitute, was in the lineage of Jesus Christ's birth line. So talk about God using someone that would be the most illogical person to be using, and God used Rahab hundreds of years later. And then we have David. David's life was not easy. He was considered small and the least in his family because he had quite a few brothers. All of his brothers were tall, they were strong, they were in the military, and they were actually on the battlefields. And that's where David went. He went to bring lunch to his brothers out in the field in the battle, and they made fun of him. And Jesse, his father, had an issue with him also because he was so young and small. Pardon me. But God saw David as a king, even as a child. Yeah, he was small, young, and he was a shepherd tending his father's sheep. But in the time that his father not threw him, but he had him, his job was to take care of sheep in the shepherd's field, he was left alone a lot. He had many, many days and nights all alone out in the field by himself, and for long periods of time. And he taught himself how to sling, like we call them a slingshot, but it's a sling, and it's like a towel, with a rock in it, and they would twirl it, and then he would let it go. If he had to learn how to kill dangerous prey, that he was out in the middle of the desert, being a shepherd, and he even killed a lion and a bear with his bare hands. But he learned how to trust God in all those times alone, and God knew his heart. And that's why God picked David as the king. The first king they had, well, we'll go into that right now, is Samuel. And Samuel, the Lord rejected King Saul, which was the king at the time of David. That's the first person that was ever a king of Israel, because the people wanted a king. They didn't want God to be their king. Even though God didn't want that, he said, go for it, just do it. So in 1 Samuel 15, verse 11, this is God talking, I greatly regret that I have set up for Saul as king, for he has turned his back from following me and has not performed my commandments, and I grieved. And it grieved Samuel so much that he cried out to the Lord all night. Because Samuel was a judge, and at that time he was the head person that spoke for the people of God's people. They didn't have kings or anything, but he was the one God spoke to get people to do what they needed to do, going through the desert or going through all the stuff that they had to go through because they needed direction, because they didn't have direction. And in 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 22, I'm not going to go through that, but Samuel was a judge, but the people wanted another king. So they wanted a king, so they chose Saul as their king, rejecting God's choice because Samuel was their choice. Samuel was used then by God to train Saul on how to serve God and to lead his people as the first king of Israel, since they rejected God himself as their judge. So here we are, when we feel rejected, like no one cares about us, we're talking here about God himself that got these people over. I mean, he did so much for the Hebrew people, and they rejected him. When Moses was up on Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, there was a thundering mountain. I mean, he was on top of the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, and there was this thunder and this trembling on the earth. The people on the ground were petrified. I mean, I would be too. I mean, God was up there talking to Moses, and I mean, you don't know what's going to be going on. And when Moses came down from the mountain, he had such a glow about him that it scared the people. So he had to put a veil over his face because the people were scared of him. Because God used Moses to talk to them because the people were afraid of him. And after some time, in 1 Samuel 16:1, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long are you going to mourn Saul?" Because Samuel had taken so many years to train Saul of being the king, and then all of a sudden, God rejected him because he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. Seeing that I have rejected him from reigning, he tells him, "Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse's house, for I have provided myself a king among his sons over Israel." This time, God got rid of the king the people wanted, and now he's going to pick his own king. And because they wanted a king like all the other nations. They didn't want God choosing another judge like Samuel. 1 Samuel 8:5, for Samuel was old and his sons didn't follow his ways. And in verse 7, God said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, Samuel," because Samuel thought they were rejecting him because he got rid of Saul. "But they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." So God was telling Samuel, don't be upset. It's not that the people rejected you. I didn't reject you. They've rejected me. So now we need to get another king. These are just a few of the stories of men and women in Scripture that seemed unlikely to be able to achieve or overcome anything that they had went through in their life and their circumstances. But God knows people's hearts, just like Rahab. She was a prostitute. She had her own gods. She didn't know it. She heard of the God of Israel, but she had enough respect and fear of him that she saved 2 men. It was because of her actions that everything went through and they got to go through and fight the battle of Jericho. I mean, just because somebody is in a certain situation doesn't mean that they aren't a good person. And that's something that in our society, we don't see that. We look at how much money somebody makes, what they drive, where they live. And sometimes it's the most lowliest of people that have the greatest insight and heart to do good for people. And God sees that. And that's where he judges people and where he will, like it says in the Bible, he's the one that puts people in high places. People can come and go, but God can bring them down and he can bring them up just as quick. And it is him. And it's by the tests and the trials that we go through. God watches us. We're always having tests. I'm 74 years old. I still go through spiritual tests because it's so easy to forget about God and what he's done for you and where you're at. And you start thinking that it's all you. I have to do it. It's me. If I don't do it, no one's going to do it. And that is such a lie. And it's so easy, even as far as many years as I follow the Lord, sometimes I think, well, where are you, God? Why am I having to go through this again? Well, because maybe I forgot something and he wants me to have a refresher course. I don't know. I have a lot of refresher course sometimes. But it's not because he's not happy with me. It's just that he's watching me to see, am I ready to put her into a different level? We all have tests. We all have shortcomings. And we have the test. And if you don't go through it the first time, he'll get you go through the test again and again and again. And then finally, like with me with my marriage, it took me 5 marriages. It took me from the ages of 19 to 50 to realize, Terry, I think God's trying to tell you that you shouldn't be married. I mean, I hate to sit here and I can laugh about it now, 24 years later. But at the time, I thought I was doing the right thing. Oh, you're supposed to be married. You're supposed to. I totally didn't. And I was a Christian. But God let me fall how many times before I really realized that this is not really the course God has for me. But he didn't ever stop using me he didn't, dismiss me. But I could have had a lot better life than I landed up having. but he's been so faithful and he still uses me. And here I am talking to people about errors that you make in life, but it doesn't mean that you're not a human and that you're not relevant, because God loves us and we all have a story and we all have a purpose. I don't care who you are or what people have said about you. You have a purpose, and God is going to, and he wants to let you achieve success. What better testimony is there than to show people from the depths of where you were and what you had to overcome? And that's the big one, overcoming so many obstacles. We all overcome obstacles, and we come out on the other side of it praising God, using our pain to help other people, comforting other people through it, knowing that God uses all things. Romans 8:28, one of my first anchor verses I ever got in the Bible when I was 20 years old, is Romans 8:28. God causes all things to work good for those who are called according to his purpose. And at 20 years old, when I started reading the Bible, I had no idea that God had a calling on my life or a purpose for my life. All I know is that I was very selfish, and I really loved my husband at the time, and he was older than me, and he always got upset. And I realized how selfish I was. And I became a better person because of it. Got hurt through it all, you bet. But I learned so much. But God was teaching me at that young age, from 21 to 30. I studied and learned. Little did I know that I was going to have 2 decades of just turmoil. But here I am, all these years later, 54 years later, and I'm praising God and trying to help other people not to have to go through such turmoil and anguish and shame and just all that you go through in life, trying to just make it, or let make people think I'm here. I am somebody. Don't disregard me, because people just disregard people like we're trash. And it's so sad. So sad. But on that note, I'm going to quit. I'm not going to be able to get into talking about Saul and Paul, which are the same persons. But I will pick it up in the next week or two and do a study on Paul, so that we can see what God, how God used that man is amazing. And hopefully give encouragement. I hope this has encouraged somebody. I hope it's encouraged anybody that's listened, and that people listen to the entirety of this video. I notice that some people, they don't really listen to it. They listen 4 or 5 minutes and they go, oh, that's enough for me. Because we live in that kind of a world that we just read the top and then we don't really get the real message inside of something, the meat of the subject, because we don't want to waste 5 or 10, 15, 20 minutes. These are 30 minutes. Usually I try to keep it at that. But whatever it is, God knows the people that are hearing it. I hope it has brought encouragement to you, and a spirit inside of you that you might want to pick up the Bible. And like I always say at the end of the video, there's always a page that I put all the verses I use, so that you can pick up a Bible and read some of these stories for yourself, because you'll get a lot more out of them. I just have to go over them quickly. But God bless you. I hope you have a great week ahead, and look forward to talking with you again in the next couple of weeks.